Inside a small marine education center on the coast of California in 1989, a man named Stephen Hillenberg sat down to draw a comic book. The comic was meant to teach children about tide pool animals. Every publisher he sent it to said no. The pages got filed away. The world moved on. 8 years later, those same pages walked into a Nickelodeon meeting room hidden inside a Hawaiian-themed pitch, alongside a tiny underwater terrarium and a man wearing a tropical shirt. The executives laughed so hard they had to leave the room. The story of how that rejected comic became the longest-running cartoon in Nickelodeon history is stranger, quieter, and more carefully built than most people realize. Buried inside it are real banned episodes, real lost footage, real production secrets, a real nuclear test site, and a real ending that almost happened in 2004 but never did. Welcome back to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The comic book no publisher wanted. Long before SpongeBob lived in a pineapple, he lived in a comic book that almost nobody saw. The year was 1989. A young man named Stephen Hillenberg was teaching marine biology at a small ocean education center in Dana Point, California. The place is called the Ocean Institute today. Back then it had a different name, the Orange County Marine Institute. Hillenberg had landed there a few years earlier, fresh out of Humboldt State University, where he had earned a degree in marine resources. He loved the ocean. He had loved it since he was a kid growing up in Anaheim, watching old Jacques Cousteau documentaries on television and dreaming about the strange creatures that lived in tide pools. His students were children mostly, school groups that came in on field trips. He taught them about tide pool ecology, about how sea life adapts to its surroundings, about the small invertebrates that cling to rocks and live in shallow saltwater. He loved the work, but he also loved drawing. He had loved that since he was a kid too, sitting at his desk with paper and pencils, sketching things he saw in his head. One day, an educational director at the institute pulled him aside and asked him a simple question. Would he be interested in making an educational comic book about the animals of the tide pools? Something the kids could read, something fun. Hillenberg said yes. The comic he drew was called The Intertidal Zone. It was full of sea creatures with personalities. Each page was an adventure inside a small, shallow pool of water along the coast. The host of the comic was a shrimp named Rocky. Rocky's co-host was a sea sponge named Bob. Yes, Bob the Sponge. The very first version of the character who would one day live inside a pineapple. Bob the Sponge looked nothing like the SpongeBob we know today. The Bob in the comic looked like a real sea sponge. Soft, lumpy, organic. The kind of thing you might find clinging to a rock in real life. He had no square pants. He had no buck teeth. He had no big blue eyes or wide grin. He was simply a sponge with a face. A teaching tool drawn for children who were trying to understand the strange life of the seafloor. Hillenberg poured a lot of love into that comic. He drew dozens of pages. He gave each creature a small voice and a small role. There was a starfish. There was a sea cucumber that looked very much like the future Kevin Sea Cucumber from the SpongeBob show. There were jokes and lessons mixed together on every page. The whole thing was meant to teach kids about a real place, a real ecosystem, the thin strip of shoreline where the ocean meets the land, the intertidal zone. His students loved it. They passed it around. They laughed at the jokes. They actually learned things from it. And so Hillenberg, encouraged by their reaction, decided he might try to publish it. He believed the comic could reach a wider audience. He believed kids beyond his small classroom would enjoy it. He sent it out. He pitched it to publishers. Every single one of them said no. The comic that would one day be the seed for a $13 billion franchise was rejected by everybody who saw it. Hillenberg kept the pages anyway. He stored them carefully. He understood, somewhere deep down, that those drawings were special to him, even if no publisher agreed. He kept teaching for a little while longer, 3 years total at the Ocean Institute. But something inside him had begun to shift. He was 28 years old, and he could feel the pull of art tugging harder than the pull of science. In 1989, the same year he finished the comic, he made a decision that changed everything. He left the institute. He enrolled at the California Institute of the Arts, often called Cal Arts, in a small town just north of Los Angeles. He was about to start over. He was going to study animation. His teacher at Cal Arts was a man named Jules Engel, a quiet legend in the field of experimental animation. Engel let Hillenberg into the program partly on the strength of the Intertidal Zone. The very comic that no publisher had wanted became the thing that opened the next door for him. The pages those publishers had rejected ended up as proof, in the eyes of one art school teacher, that Hillenberg had something worth nurturing. While studying at Cal Arts, Hillenberg made short animated films. One of them was called Wormholes. It was based on Albert Einstein's theory of relativity creativity, of all things, and it actually won an award at an animation festival in Ottawa, Canada. The award was for Best Concept. At that same festival, Hillenberg met a man named Joe Murray. Murray was a cartoonist who had been working on his own animated show, a weird, charming, slightly off-kilter show called Rocko's Modern Life. Murray hired Hillenberg. Rocko's Modern Life is where SpongeBob really began to take shape, even though the world did not know it yet. Hillenberg started as a writer and storyboard artist. By the third season, he had been promoted to director and producer. He was learning, scene by scene, episode by episode, how to actually run an animated show, how the sausage gets made, how a story moves from a sketch on paper to a finished cartoon on television. He was surrounded by people who would later become the heart of SpongeBob's crew. Tom Kenny was there, doing voices. A writer named Mr. Lawrence was there, the man who would one day voice Plankton. Paul Tibbett was there. Derek Dryman would join later. The team was assembling itself, slowly, without any of them realizing it. Then, around 1996, Rocko's Modern Life ended. That was the moment everything changed. A writer on Rocko named Martin Olson had stumbled across pages from the Intertitle Zone, the very same comic that no publisher had wanted 7 years earlier. Olson read it. He thought it was wonderful. He pulled Hillenberg aside one day and said something simple. He said Hillenberg should make this into a show. He should take the sea creatures and the underwater world and turn them into a cartoon. Hillenberg, by his own admission, had not been planning to create his own series. He had watched Joe Murray, the creator of Rocko, struggle with all the headaches that come with running a show, the long hours, the constant problems, the endless stream of decisions. Hillenberg had thought, while watching all that he never wanted to do it himself, but Olson kept pushing, and the idea began to grow. Hillenberg started thinking about the comic again. He pulled out the pages. He looked at Bob the Sponge. He started imagining what the character could become if he was redesigned for animation. Not a realistic sea sponge anymore, something stranger, something funnier. He thought about the shape of a kitchen sponge, the kind people use to wash dishes. Square, yellow, full of holes. He thought about how a character like that could move and bend and stretch in ways no real sponge ever could. He thought about a creature that was, in his own words, an innocent, someone who saw the world with simple, total wonder. There was something about a sponge that worked for him. Real sponges, he later said in an interview, are odd. People think of them as odd. They sit on rocks, they filter water, they do not really do much else. But cartoon sponges could do anything. They could be bent into any shape. They could be flexible. They could be magical. A sponge was the perfect creature, in his mind, to build a show around. The world he started building around that sponge came directly from his own life. The Krusty Krab, the underwater fast food restaurant where SpongeBob would one day work, was based on a real seafood restaurant in Maine. Hillenberg had worked there as a cook one summer. The restaurant had a pirate theme. The cooks dressed up as pirates and sang silly songs to entertain the kids. 2 of those songs would later be turned into the SpongeBob theme song. The opening line that millions of children would shout for the next 25 years came from Hillenberg's actual summer job. The narrator of the show, the calm French-accented voice that introduces almost every episode, was a tribute to Jacques Cousteau, the same Cousteau whose documentaries Hillenberg had watched as a child, the same Cousteau who had inspired him to study marine biology in the first place. The narrator's name in the show is Frenchie. Frenchie is a love letter, in voice form, from Hillenberg to the man who first made him fall in love with the sea. Other characters were pulled from his teaching days too. Sandy Cheeks, the squirrel who lives underwater inside a glass dome, was based partly on the kids who came through the institute. The wide-eyed wonder, the eagerness, the way young students would press their faces against tide pool tanks. Even Plankton would echo something Hillenberg had taught his kids. Plankton, the tiny green villain, says in one episode that he eats holographic meatloaf. That joke is a science joke. Real plankton in the ocean get their energy from the sun through a process called photosynthesis. Holograms are made of light. The joke is precise. It comes from a teacher who could not stop being a teacher even when he was making a cartoon. Hillenberg started thinking, around 1994, about turning his sponge character into a show. He began to sketch new versions of Bob. He began to imagine the underwater town where the sponge would live. He began, slowly, to assemble the world. He went on a trip to Baja California in February of that year, a surfing trip, and at one point he sat by a campfire with his sketchbook and he drew. He drew sea creatures. He drew the rough shape of an underwater city. He started laying out the bones of a show beside the ocean he loved with a fire flickering on the sand. It would be 3 more years before he pitched anything to a network. 3 more years of sketching, of thinking, of letting the idea simmer. 3 more years before a cartoon nobody yet knew about would walk through the doors of Nickelodeon and meet the executives who would decide its fate. But all of it, every single piece of it, traces back to one specific place, a small marine institute on the coast of California, a teacher with a love for tide pools and a love for drawing, a comic book that nobody wanted to publish, a shrimp named Rocky, a soft, round sea sponge named Bob. That comic sat in a folder for a very long time after it was rejected. Years passed. The world moved on. Most of the pages stayed hidden. Only a small handful were ever shown publicly. A few appeared in the first issue of SpongeBob comics in 2011, decades after they were drawn. The rest stayed quiet, stored away, privately treasured. Then, in April of 2024, something quiet and beautiful happened. The full comic was finally uploaded to the Internet Archive. Anyone with an internet connection could read it. 35 years after it was drawn, after every publisher had passed, after the world had decided it did not want this small educational comic about tide pool animals, the comic finally arrived in front of an audience. A massive one. The grandchildren of the kids who had first read it in a small classroom in Dana Point could now flip through the pages too. The author was no longer alive to see most of that, of course. Hillenberg had passed away in 2018, 6 years earlier. He never lived to see his original comic finally reach the audience he had once dreamed it would. But the work survived. The pages survived. The sponge survived. It is a strange thing to sit with. A comic that was rejected by everybody became the foundation for one of the most watched television shows in human history. A teaching tool, drawn on the side of a desk in a small marine center, grew into a global empire of toys and movies and theme park attractions and Broadway musicals and Super Bowl halftime tributes. A sponge nobody wanted became a sponge that almost every child on Earth could recognize from a single yellow square. There is something quiet about that story, something gentle, the years of nothing, the slow growth, the patience, the way the ocean itself works in a way. Things settle to the bottom, things drift, things wait, and then one day, without warning, they emerge. The intertidal zone was the seed. It was buried for a very long time. The full bloom would not arrive until much later, in an entirely different decade, in an entirely different room, on an entirely different coast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because before the world ever met SpongeBob, before he had a square shape and a yellow color and a job at a fast food joint and a pet snail and a starfish best friend, before Bikini Bottom was even a sketch on a napkin, there was one more impossible obstacle the show had to clear. A pitch meeting, a room full of executives, a Hawaiian shirt, a small underwater terrarium, and a name that would not survive the day. Section 2. The pitch that broke the room. The summer of 1997 was warm in Burbank, California. The Nickelodeon animation studio sat in a long, low building near the Walt Disney lot, surrounded by palm trees and parking spaces. Inside that building, on a particular afternoon, a small group of men were about to walk into a meeting room with the strangest pitch the studio had ever seen. The lead man wore a Hawaiian shirt. Steven Hillenberg had decided a few weeks earlier that he was finally going to do it. He was going to pitch his sponge show to Nickelodeon. After 3 years of quiet sketching and slow building, after months of late-night meetings at his own house with his small creative team, the idea was finally ready. The world he had been building inside his head was about to leave his head. He was not going alone. He had a team. Derek Dryman was with him. Dryman had begged Hillenberg for a job on the show. He had worked on Rocko's Modern Life as a late recruit. He was a storyboard artist, fast and clever, and good at the strange visual humor Hillenberg loved. Hillenberg had originally wanted Dryman's storyboard partner, a man named Mark O'Hare, but O'Hare had just created his own newspaper comic strip called Citizen Dog and did not have time, so Dryman got his chance. He pestered Hillenberg until Hillenberg agreed. The two of them had been meeting at Hillenberg's house for months, several times a week, just talking and drawing and sketching out the world. Tim Hill was with them too. Hill was a writer who had helped develop the original Story Bible, the document that explains how a show works and what its characters are like. He had a gift for tone and for jokes. Hillenberg trusted him, and Nick Jennings was there. Jennings was the art director. He was the man responsible for figuring out what the world of the show would actually look like. The colors, the textures, the shape of every house and every street. Tom Kenny, who would one day voice the main character, had once described Jennings as a graphics mentor. He was that good. Together, the four of them were about to walk into a room of executives and try to sell something nobody had ever seen before. An animated cartoon set entirely underwater, about a sponge. They had thought a lot about how to do it. Hillenberg knew, from his time on Rocko's Modern Life, how these meetings usually went. Someone walks in with a folder of drawings. Someone holds up a few sketches. Someone reads from a notes page. The executives nod politely. The pitch ends. A decision gets made later, in some other room, by people who were not even there. He did not want that. He wanted to make the executives feel the show. He wanted them to walk out of that room with the underwater world stuck in their heads. He wanted them to laugh so hard they would have no choice but to greenlight the project. So the team got creative. Hillenberg showed up wearing a Hawaiian shirt, bright and loud, the kind a tourist might wear on a cruise ship. He had brought along an actual underwater terrarium, a glass tank, just like a fish tank, but with little models of the characters inside. A tiny SpongeBob, a tiny Patrick, a tiny Squidward, a tiny Mr. Krabs, a tiny Krusty Krab restaurant. The team had made these by hand. They had built a miniature version of Bikini Bottom and brought it to the meeting room and set it on the table. They had also brought music, Hawaiian music, soft and tropical, played in the background as the executives walked in. The whole thing was meant to feel less like a pitch and more like a vacation, a tiki bar, a trip to a place no one had been before. The executives in the room were powerful people. Eric Coleman was there. Kevin Kay was there. Albie Hecht was there. These were the men who decided which cartoons got made and which ones did not. They were the gatekeepers. If the pitch did not land with them, the show was finished before it had even started. Hillenberg began. He talked about the sponge. He talked about Bikini Bottom. He held up the little models. He pointed to the underwater terrarium. He showed sketches. He acted out scenes. Dryman and Hill jumped in. Jennings showed off the visual world he had imagined. The four of them performed the entire show, right there in the room, with their voices and their hands and their tiny figurines. What happened next has become a small legend in animation history. The executives started laughing. Not polite laughing, real laughing. The kind that comes from your stomach and shakes your shoulders. Eric Coleman would later describe the pitch as pretty amazing. Albie Hecht would later say it was a performance he wished he had on tape. Kevin Kay and Hecht actually had to step outside the meeting room. They were laughing so hard they could not breathe. They needed a moment to recover. This terrified the four men inside. Dryman, who would later describe the pitch as one of the most stressful things he had ever done, watched the executives leave the room and assumed the worst. He thought they hated it. He thought they had walked out because the pitch had failed so badly. He thought it was over. It was the opposite. The executives were laughing because they loved it. They came back into the room and made a decision so quickly it shocked the team. Dryman had expected the network to take weeks to think it over. Instead, the executives offered to fund a pilot episode right then, right there in the room. They wanted to see more. The team had 2 weeks to write the pilot. 2 weeks. That is almost no time at all in animation. Real cartoons can take months to plan and script and storyboard. The team had to figure out a story, write the dialogue, sketch the boards, and lock the whole thing down in just 14 days. They did not have a story yet. Hillenberg had originally wanted the pilot to follow SpongeBob and Squidward on a road trip, an idea he had borrowed from a 1989 movie called Pow Wow Highway. But Hillenberg gave that idea up almost immediately. It did not feel right for a first episode. It needed to be smaller, more grounded, something that introduced the world without showing too much of it at once. So Hillenberg and Dryman went out to dinner one night and tried to figure out what the pilot should actually be about. They sat across from each other at a table and tossed ideas back and forth. And eventually, Hillenberg remembered something from his own childhood, something from his Boy Scout years, a small experience, a personal one, where someone had been sent on a long, pointless errand as a kind of test. The idea clicked. They could turn that into a story. SpongeBob applies for a job at the Krusty Krab. Mr. Krabs decides to test him by sending him on a fake errand to find a made-up tool. SpongeBob actually finds it. He passes the test. He gets the job. That was it. That was the pilot. The episode would be called Help Wanted. The team sat down and wrote it. The storyboard was finalized on June 3rd, 1997. The voice actors recorded their lines. The animation began. But there was a problem. A very big problem. Nobody had checked the name yet. The character was called SpongeBoy at this point. Not SpongeBob, SpongeBoy. The show itself was going to be called SpongeBoy Ahoy. The name had a little nautical ring to it. Hillenberg liked the way it sounded. The team had been using SpongeBoy for months. The pitch had had used SpongeBoy. The pilot script said SpongeBoy. Tom Kenny had recorded all of his lines saying SpongeBoy. Then, in November of 1997, the legal department at Nickelodeon ran a routine check. The kind of check every studio runs before a name gets locked in. They wanted to make sure no other company already owned the name SpongeBoy. Someone did, a pencil company. There was an art-themed pencil product already on the market that used the name SpongeBoy. The trademark was already registered. Nickelodeon could not use it. The voice acting was already done. The pilot was already in production. The character had a name they could not legally keep. Hillenberg had to come up with a new one. Quickly, he sat down and started thinking about it. He decided that the name still had to contain the word sponge. That part was important. If the name did not include sponge, audiences might not understand what the character was. They might mistake him for something else. A piece of cheese, for example. Hillenberg actually said this in interviews later. He worried that without the word sponge in the name, viewers would look at the yellow square character and assume he was a cheese man. He could not let that happen. So the new name had to start with sponge. He thought about it. He tried different combinations. SpongeBob came to him. It had a friendly, simple sound. It sounded like a person, like somebody you could be friends with. He liked it. Then the second part, the last name, the family name, that came from a moment that has been told and retold many times in the show's history. Tom Kenny was looking at a sketch of the character, the square shape, the brown rectangle pants, the red tie. Kenny said something offhand. He said something like, "Look at this sponge in square pants, thinking he can get a job at a fast food place." That was it, SquarePants. The name jumped out of the sentence and stuck. Hillenberg loved how it sounded. He felt it reinforced the character's quiet nerdiness. A sponge with a square shape and the literal last name SquarePants. Direct, silly, memorable. SpongeBob SquarePants. The team had to scramble. They had to redo voice work. They had to update the title cards. They had to rewrite the pilot's main name reference. The pencil company never knew how close they had come to inheriting one of the most famous names in animation history. There was one more obstacle still ahead, a bigger one. The pilot was good. The executives liked it. They watched it once and then asked to watch it again, immediately, because they liked it that much. Seema Zargami, an executive at the network, would later describe the reaction in the room. The first instinct was to see it again, both because they enjoyed it and because they had never seen anything quite like it before. But before the network would commit to a full series, they had a request, a condition. They wanted SpongeBob to be a child. This horrified Hillenberg. The executive's reasoning was simple from a business standpoint. Their most popular shows at the time, programs like Hey Arnold, were about kids. Kids who went to school. Kids who hung out with other kids. The network believed that children's cartoons worked best when the main characters were also children. They wanted SpongeBob to fit that pattern. They wanted him to go to school. They wanted him to have classmates and homework and a teacher. Hillenberg had built SpongeBob as an adult, a grown sponge with a job and a house and his own life. The whole point of the character was that he had a small, contained adult life that he found enormous joy in. Frying patties at a fast food restaurant, living next to neighbors, going to bed at night and waking up the next morning to do it all again. SpongeBob was meant to be the most cheerful adult in the world, not a kid. Hillenberg considered walking away. He genuinely thought about ending the project right there. If the network wanted to change the entire idea of who his main character was, the show would no longer be the show he had imagined. It would be something else. Some other show, made by some other person, wearing the costume of his own work. He did not walk away. He found a compromise instead. He suggested adding a new character, a boating school teacher, a pufferfish named Mrs. Puff. SpongeBob would not be a kid, but he would attend boating school as an adult, the same way grown-ups in real life sometimes go to driving school. He would have a teacher. He would have classroom scenes. The network's request would be satisfied without changing who SpongeBob actually was at his core. The compromise worked. The network accepted it. Mrs. Puff was added to the cast. SpongeBob would remain an adult. Hillenberg later said he was happy with the trade. The network got what it wanted. He kept his character intact, and the show gained Mrs. Puff, who would go on to become one of the most quietly tragic supporting characters on the entire program. A pufferfish who has spent decades trying to teach a sponge how to drive a boat, who fails every single attempt, who has been to jail at least once because of those failed driving tests, and who has never given up on him, even though her own life has clearly been ruined by his cheerful incompetence. The pilot finished production in 1997. It aired in 1999. The series began. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the Channel tremendously. But there was a separate question lurking in the background of all of this that nobody quite knew how to answer. The show had a setting, an underwater town where SpongeBob lived, a place called Bikini Bottom. The name had been chosen, the town had been built, but the name itself was strange. It was not a random word picked out of a hat. It came from somewhere real, a real place, a real location, on a real map, with a real history that almost no child watching the show would ever learn about. A history with explosions in it. Section 3, Bikini Atoll, the real place beneath the pineapple. Bikini Bottom is a strange name when you stop to think about it. Most cartoon towns get simple, made-up names. Springfield, Quahog, Townsville, names that sound like places but are not. Bikini Bottom is different. The name was not invented from nothing. It was borrowed. It was lifted gently and quietly from a real place that exists on a real map. And the real place has a history that almost no child watching the show would ever learn about on their own. Bikini Atoll sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It is part of a chain of small islands called the Marshall Islands, halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines. An atoll, in simple terms, is a ring-shaped reef made of coral. The reef forms a circle. Inside the circle is a calm, shallow lagoon. Around the outside is the deeper open sea. Tiny islands often sit along the ring of the ring, like little green dots floating on top of the water. Bikini Atoll has 23 of these small islands forming its ring. The largest of them is called Bikini Island. The whole place is breathtakingly beautiful. Clear blue water, white sand, palm trees swaying in the trade winds. People lived there for centuries. The name Bikini comes from the original Marshallese name for the island, Pikini. Peak meant a flat surface. Ni meant coconut tree. So the name, in the original language of the islanders, meant something like the surface of coconuts, a small, soft, descriptive word for a small, soft, gentle place. The Bikini Islanders had a quiet life on the atoll. They were skilled boat builders. They sailed two-hulled canoes between the islands. They fished. They gathered shellfish. They grew food on the small patches of land that rose above the water. The whole way of life was tied to the ocean around them. They ate from it. They traveled across it. They lived inside its rhythms. There were about 167 of them, give or take, when their world ended. The end came in 1946. The Second World War had just finished. The United States military had developed nuclear weapons, the most destructive bombs the world had ever seen, and had used 2 of them against Japan in 1945. The war was over, but the weapons themselves were brand new. The military wanted to test more of them. They wanted to see what these bombs could do under different conditions, on land, underwater, in the air. They needed somewhere to do it, somewhere remote, somewhere far away from American cities, and far away from anyone who might complain. They picked Bikini Atoll. The military arrived and told the Bikini Islanders that they had to leave. Not forever, the islanders were told, just for a little while. The Americans needed the atoll for a short period of testing, and after that, the islanders could come back home. The islanders, faced with armed soldiers and military officers, agreed. They were moved off their home island and taken to a smaller atoll called Rongerik, about 100 miles to the east. Rongerik was a disaster. The new island did not have enough food. The fish in its waters were different. Some of them were toxic. The plants did not grow the way the islanders were used to. Within 2 years, the people who had been moved off Bikini were starving. The promise of going home soon was already crumbling. They were eventually moved again to another atoll, then another, then to a small place called Kili Island, which was only about 1/6 the size of their original home. The testing began on July 1st, 1946. The first bomb was called Able. It was dropped from a plane. It detonated in the air above a fleet of empty warships that the military had parked in the lagoon to see what nuclear blasts would do to them. The next bomb was called Baker. It was a different test. Baker was detonated underwater. The bomb sat on a cable beneath the lagoon's surface, and when it went off, it created an enormous column of water and radioactive vapor that shot thousands of feet into the air. The image of the Baker explosion is one of the most famous photographs in human history. A vast white pillar of water rising out of the sea, a small mushroom of cloud forming at the top. That was just the beginning. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear bombs at Bikini Atoll, some on the air, some on the surface, some underwater, some on the reef itself. The largest of them was tested on March 1st, 1954. It was called Bravo. It was a hydrogen bomb, much more powerful than the old atomic bombs. The Bravo blast was equivalent in force to roughly 1,000 of the bombs that had been dropped on Hiroshima Hiroshima 9 years earlier. It carved a massive crater out of the reef. It threw radioactive ash into the air. It poisoned the wind for hundreds of miles. People on nearby atolls, who had nothing to do with the test, got sick from the fallout. Fishermen on a Japanese boat downwind from Bravo were exposed to radiation. One of them died. The Bikini Islanders never went home. They tried eventually. In the 1970s, after years of pressure, the United States government decided the radiation had finally faded enough to allow people to return. About 200 Bikinians were taken back to their original island in 1972. They lived there for about 6 years. Then, scientists tested their bodies and discovered something terrible. The islanders had ingested more radioactive cesium from the contaminated soil and food than any other human population ever measured. The fish, the coconuts, the plants, the dust on the ground, all of it still carried poison. The islanders were removed again in 1978. They have never been able to permanently return. The radiation will still be present in some form for thousands of years. This is the place SpongeBob is named after. Steven Hillenberg knew this. The team that built the show knew this. Tom Kenny, in a 2015 interview with the Huffington Post, confirmed it directly. Bikini Bottom, he said, is named after Bikini Atoll. The fictional underwater city sits, in the show's geography, beneath the real lagoon where the bombs were detonated. The connection is not an accident. It is built into the foundation of the show, right there, beneath every joke and every gag and every cheerful sponge moment is the quiet shadow of one of the saddest stories of the 20th century. For decades, fans have wondered what this means. A theory began circulating online sometime around the late 2000s and early 2010s. The theory had a few different versions, but the core idea was simple. The strange creatures of Bikini Bottom, the talking sponges and starfish and squids, the wide-eyed underwater city full of impossible characters, are the result of nuclear testing. The radiation from the 23 bombs seeped into the seabed below the atoll. Marine life down there was changed, mutated, brought to a kind of strange, glowing, conscious life that an ordinary sea sponge could never have developed on its own. SpongeBob, in this reading, is not just a cartoon. He is what is left after the world above was destroyed. The theory has grown over the years. Fans pointed to certain things in the show that seemed to support it. The clothing styles in Bikini Bottom often look like they belong to the 1940s and 1950s, the same era as the bomb tests. There is an episode from 2001 called Dying for Pie, in which Squidward is hit in the face with what he believes is an explosive pie. The explosion that follows is shown in live-action footage of an actual nuclear blast. The mushroom cloud in that frame, fans have noted, looks remarkably similar to photos of the Bikini Atoll tests, specifically the Baker underwater test from 1946. Then there is Rock Bottom. Rock Bottom is a season 1 episode in which SpongeBob and Patrick accidentally take the wrong bus home and find themselves in a strange, dark city far below Bikini Bottom. Everything about Rock Bottom is wrong. The creatures who live there speak in clicking noises that sound nothing like normal Bikini Bottom speech. The lights flicker. The signs are confusing. The bus schedule is impossible to understand. SpongeBob cannot find his way out. Fans of the radiation theory have pointed at Rock Bottom and called it something specific. They believe Rock Bottom is the actual nuclear crater left by the bombs, the deeper, stranger, more damaged version of the underwater world, the place where the radiation hit hardest and the creatures became most distorted. It is just a fan theory, officially. A representative for Nickelodeon stated in an email to the website Cracked in 2021 that the show is set in Bikini Bottom. That was the company line, a polite refusal to confirm anything more. But something interesting happened over the years. People who actually worked on the show began to talk. In 2024, the actor who voices Plankton, a man named Mr. Lawrence, said something during an interview that stunned fans. He was asked directly about the radiation theory. His response was simple. He said the theory was absolutely true. He went further. He said that during the early development of the show, in the first season, the writers and creators had openly discussed exactly that idea. They had talked about whether to play off of what he called the apocalyptic thing, the idea that the whole world above the surface was dead, that something terrible had happened up there, that Bikini Bottom and its strange residents were what was left after the surface world had been destroyed. He said the team had discussed how far to take the concept. Other voice actors have given different answers. Tom Kenny, in his 2015 interview, was asked whether SpongeBob and his friends are mutations. aliens? He said no. He said he did not think the characters were the result of radiation.
Roger Bumpus, the voice of Squidward,
said in 2024 that he did not believe the theory either. The actors are not in agreement. Mr. Lawrence says yes. Tom Kenny says no. Roger Bumpus says no. Then there was an even stranger development. In 2021, the website Cracked published an article quoting an anonymous staffer at Nickelodeon. The staffer worked in the network's creative promotions department. The staffer was speaking on the condition of anonymity, meaning their name was not used, because they were worried about getting in trouble at work for talking. The staffer said something fascinating. They said the radiation theory is essentially considered canon among people who work on or around SpongeBob SquarePants. The staffer described it as functioning like well-accepted fan fiction inside the studio. People talk about it in casual conversation. It comes up at meetings. It is, the staffer said, the unofficial truth of the show, even though the company will never confirm it publicly. There is also the matter of the connection between Bikini Atoll and other pop culture. The 1954 Japanese movie Godzilla was inspired, at least in part, by the same nuclear tests that took place at Bikini. The filmmakers behind Godzilla wanted to tell the story of what happens when humans wake up something terrible by playing with weapons too powerful to control. A monster awakened by underwater nuclear blasts. The metaphor was deliberate. The connection was direct. Godzilla and SpongeBob, two of the most beloved fictional sea creatures of the 20th century, both come from the same poisoned coral reef. Even the swimsuit gets its name from the same place. The two-piece bathing suit called the Bikini was named after Bikini Atoll. A French designer named Louis Réard introduced his version of the swimsuit in 1946, just 4 days after the first nuclear bomb detonated over the atoll. He chose the name Bikini specifically because the explosion was so famous in the news at the time. He said his swimsuit would be just as explosive as the bomb. The name stuck. Every two-piece swimsuit on every beach in the world, every summer, carries the quiet echo of that first nuclear detonation. So Bikini Bottom is named after a swimsuit, which is named after a real place, which is named after a coconut tree on a flat surface, which was the home of a small island people who were taken from their land and never allowed to return. All of that history is buried, gently, inside the silly title of a children's cartoon. Hillenberg, the man who picked the name, never made a big deal about it. He never gave long interviews explaining the connection. He let the name sit there, doing its quiet work, hidden in plain sight. He had a fondness for hiding small adult truths inside cheerful surfaces. The name was just one of them. Frenchie the narrator was a tribute to a real ocean explorer. The Krusty Krab was based on a real seafood restaurant. The marine biology jokes were precise and accurate. The setting was named after one of the saddest places on Earth. There is something quiet about that, something almost tender. A man who had taught children about the ocean for years, who had watched kids fall in love with tide pools and small fish, decided to set his cartoon underneath the spot where humans had done the worst thing they had ever done to that ocean. He did not draw attention to it. He just placed his strange, joyful little world right there in the shadow of the bombs and let the cheerful sponge live on. The name Bikini Bottom was set. The show was building. The pilot was finished. The pitch had broken the room. The pencil company name disaster had been navigated. Hillenberg's underwater town had a real-world location buried beneath it. The crew was beginning to hum. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What none of them could have predicted in those early years was that the show would eventually need to invent something more than just episodes. It would need to invent its own legends, its own quiet myths inside the larger myth. A specific kind of episode, marketed as a long-lost treasure that would arrive on television with so much fanfare that more than 7 million people would tune in just to see it. An episode whose own title would become a small joke about itself. Section 4, the real lost episode, and why it was called that. The phrase lost episode is a strange one for a television show that has aired thousands of times across hundreds of channels in dozens of countries. There is almost no such thing as a truly lost piece of SpongeBob. The show has been recorded, archived, distributed, and rebroadcast more times than almost any other animated program in history. Every episode that has aired exists somewhere. Every script has been filed away. Every storyboard sits in a folder. Yet there is one episode, and only one, that officially carries that title. Its real name is The Sponge Who Could Fly. It is the 19th episode of the 3rd season. It aired on March 21st, 2003, and the story of how it earned the nickname Lost Episode, and how that nickname turned into a real marketing event watched by more than 7 million people is one of the strangest small chapters in the show's history. The story begins, as so many SpongeBob stories do, with a small piece of animation. Sometime in the early 2000s, supervising producer Derek Dryman needed a freelance animator to do a short scene. He approached an animator named Mark O'Hare. O'Hare was an animation veteran who would later create his own newspaper comic strip, Citizen Dog, and who was already part of Hillenberg's creative orbit. Dryman told O'Hare that the studio needed somebody to animate a strange little sequence. A walk cycle, in animation terms, is a short looping piece of footage where a character walks. You can drop a walk cycle into any scene and reuse it. They are common in cartoon production. Dryman gave O'Hare a piece of music. The music was, by O'Hare's own description, a bad synthesizer song, a cheap, tinny piece of background music. O'Hare was told to do something specific with it, a weird walk to it, just something strange, something funny, something off. O'Hare animated the scene. It was a short clip of SpongeBob doing a weird, looping, almost robotic walk to the strange music. He delivered it to the studio. Dryman kept calling it the Lost Episode walk around the office. O'Hare overheard this and assumed his work had been thrown away. He thought the scene had ended up on the cutting room floor. He thought it had been lost in the technical sense, scrapped, deleted, never used. The truth dawned on him slowly. The walk cycle had not been cut. The walk cycle was the opening of an actual episode, an episode whose entire title was The Lost Episode. The scene Dryman had been calling the Lost Episode walk was literally the walk cycle from the Lost Episode. O'Hare had been animating a fake intro for an episode that was deliberately built around the joke that it might be lost. The episode itself was a special, longer than usual production. The team had decided to release it as something separate from the regular Season 3 lineup. They were going to package it as a piece of treasure, a long-buried gem, something rare. The plot of the episode, on the inside, is gentle and sweet. SpongeBob goes jellyfishing one day, the way he always does, and looks up at the jellyfish floating peacefully through the water above him. He realizes, in a quiet moment, that he wishes he could fly with them. He starts trying. He builds machines. He attaches himself to kites. He constructs flying contraptions out of household items. None of it works. Eventually, by accident, he discovers that tucking a hairdryer into his pants while answering the phone causes his pants to inflate and lift him off the ground. He can fly. The rest of the episode plays out the way a small fable might. SpongeBob uses his new flying ability to help the people of Bikini Bottom. He flies around town doing favors. He becomes a kind of accidental hero. The townspeople love him at first. Then they get greedy. They demand more of his time. They want him to fly errands constantly. He wants to be left alone. He just wanted to fly with the jellyfish. He never wanted the responsibility of being the town's flying servant. The crowd eventually attacks him. They destroy his magical pants. The flying ends. But the jellyfish themselves come to his rescue. They lift him gently into the air at the end of the episode. He finally gets to do the only thing he ever wanted. He floats among them peacefully, the way he had imagined. That is the inside of the episode, the actual cartoon. A quiet, small story about wanting something simple and being denied it by the demands of other people. It is a sweet idea, well executed, packed with musical numbers. The outside of the episode is where things got weird. The team decided to wrap the cartoon inside a frame story. The host of this frame story would be Patchy the Pirate, the live-action character played by Tom Kenny, who had been introduced 2 seasons earlier. Patchy is a grown man in a pirate costume who lives in Encino, California, and runs the fictional SpongeBob SquarePants fan club. He is, by his own claim, SpongeBob's biggest fan. He hosts double-length episodes. He talks directly to the audience. He owns enormous amounts of SpongeBob merchandise. In this episode, Patchy informs the children watching at home that he has lost the lost episode. The tape is gone. He cannot find it. He becomes despondent. He delivers a sad little tribute to SpongeBob, a kind of memorial montage of clips from past episodes, complete with music. He says he wishes he had a treasure map. A treasure map immediately flies through his living room window. He follows it to a buried chest at a sandy playground. A miner emerges from the ground, holding a VHS tape. The miner is played in a small cameo by Stephen Hillenberg himself. Patchy takes the tape home. He plays it. The screen shows a long, looping series of SpongeBob walk cycles set to bad music. The animation Mark O'Hare had created. Patchy watches in horror. The tape just keeps playing the weird walks. Then the SMPTE color bars appear, the technical pattern that signals the end of a recorded tape. That is the lost episode, supposedly. Patchy explodes. He believes SpongeBob has betrayed him. The lost episode is a bunch of cheap walk cycles. He starts ripping framed pictures of SpongeBob off his walls. He throws his merchandise into piles. He declares that he is done with SpongeBob forever. He renounces his fan club presidency. He runs out the door, swearing he is finished. Then, his parrot, Potty, calls out to him. The real lost episode is just starting. The walk cycles were a fake out. The actual cartoon is about to begin. Patchy comes scrambling back. He shoves all his merchandise back onto his shelves in a frantic reverse motion. The crew accomplished this scene by filming the destruction sequence and then playing it backwards in editing. Patchy sits down. He calms himself. The actual cartoon, The Sponge Who Could Fly, finally begins. Stephen Hillenberg, in the audio commentary recorded for the DVD release, confirmed something specific about Patchy's tantrum. The smoke that shoots out of Patchy's ears during his angry breakdown was not exaggerated by the special effects team. Tom Kenny actually performed the reaction so intensely that real smoke effects were used. Hillenberg said Kenny made smoke shoot out of his ears for real. The whole structure of the episode is a joke about itself. The lost episode is found, then revealed to be a disappointment, then revealed to be a fake out, then turns out to be a real cartoon underneath. The title is a punchline. The frame story is a comedy about the audience's own expectations. Then there was the marketing. Nickelodeon decided to turn the episode into a major event. They built a 2-hour countdown marathon leading up to the world premiere on March 21st, 2003. The marathon was hosted by Patchy himself in pretend search of his missing tape and featured a parade of celebrity guest appearances. Whoopi Goldberg appeared, Coolio appeared, Rosie Perez appeared, Frankie Muniz appeared, Randy Jackson appeared, Jennifer Love Hewitt appeared. Each of them did short comedic segments helping Patchy hunt for the lost episode. The hosts of a Nickelodeon show called You Pick Live also showed up to comment on the search. The whole thing was treated like a national television event. There was also a sweepstakes sponsored by Burger King, Hostess, Cheetos, the yogurt brand Danimals, and a movie called Daddy Daycare that was being released around the same time. The grand prize was a trip to Jamaica, $1,000 in cash, a treasure chest stuffed with SpongeBob merchandise, and a second treasure chest filled with Twinkies. 500 runners-up would win a special t-shirt designed for the event. The campaign was massive. The episode itself was released on home video before it even aired on television. A VHS tape called The Sponge Who Could Fly went on sale on March 4th, 2003. So did a DVD set called Lost at Sea, which contained the episode as well. Both were available 17 days before the episode officially premiered on Nickelodeon. When the episode finally aired on March 21st, 2003, more than 7 million people tuned in. This was, at the time, the highest viewership any episode of SpongeBob SquarePants had ever received. The previous record had been held by an episode called Party Pooper Pants, which had drawn about 6,321,000 viewers in May of 2002. The Sponge Who Could Fly broke that record. The new record would stand until November of 2005, when an episode called Have You Seen This Snail received nearly 8 million viewers. The lost episode, in other words, was the most watched piece of SpongeBob ever made at the moment of its release. A massive cultural event, built around a small joke about an episode that did not actually exist. There is one more strange detail tucked inside the production of the episode, a detail that has to do with American broadcast law. Patchy's house throughout the episode is filled with SpongeBob merchandise. Plush toys, posters, pillows, bedspreads. The walls are covered with SpongeBob memorabilia. But if you look closely at any of those merchandise items, you will notice that something is off. The SpongeBob on the plush toys is slightly different from the SpongeBob on the show. He has large black pupils instead of his normal blue eyes. He wears a bow tie instead of his red necktie. His hat is black instead of white. The Patrick figurines have larger pupils. Squidward has black vertical stripes on his shirt. Gary the Snail has slightly altered eyes. This was deliberate. The Federal Communications Commission, the United States government agency that regulates broadcast television, has rules about advertising products to children during children's programming. Specifically, the rules say a show cannot display real, purchasable merchandise of itself during its own airtime. That counts as advertising directed at minors during a program meant for the same audience. Showing actual SpongeBob plush toys on the SpongeBob show would technically be illegal illegal under those rules, so the prop department made fake versions. They created plush toys and merchandise that looked similar to real SpongeBob products, but were just different enough that they could not be mistaken for items a child could actually buy in stores. A bow tie instead of a regular tie, a black hat, different eyes. None of these items existed in the real merchandise lineup. They were custom-made fakes, designed to fill Patchy's house with SpongeBob stuff, without breaking advertising regulations. It is the kind of detail almost no viewer would ever notice. A small, quiet, legal compliance, baked into the visual texture of a comedy episode about a fan club president having a meltdown in his living room. The Sponge Who Could Fly ended up being one of the most important episodes in the show's history, even though many critics did not love it. Some reviewers complained that the live-action Patchy segments were too long. One critic for the Los Angeles Daily News said that the live-action material was, in his words, what should be lost. Another reviewer at DVD Verdict called it the one misstep in an otherwise strong third season. The audience disagreed. The ratings were enormous. The merchandise flew off shelves. The episode would later be adapted into a stage musical that toured the United Kingdom and Ireland in 2009, with 12 original songs and full choreography. There is also a small piece of trivia that fans love. The episode contains an in-joke about its own existence. When the announcer on Patchy's television finally says, "And now, the real lost episode," the screen displays a title card. The title card reads, SpongeBob SquarePants, episode 118, the real lost episode. The episode is calling itself episode 118. This was a deliberate joke. If you counted every short segment from the first 3 seasons as a separate piece, the math actually almost works out. The Sponge Who Could Fly really would be near that number in the count. The lost episode was the show admitting, gently and openly, that it had become big enough to start mythologizing itself, to create its own legends, to pretend it had hidden treasures buried in vaults that nobody could find. The show had reached a point of cultural success where it could afford to play with the audience's expectations on this scale. That confidence was new. The show had been on the air for less than 4 years when the lost episode aired, but it had grown enough, fast enough, to attempt something this elaborate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A lot of that confidence rested on one single character, not SpongeBob himself, the character who had hosted the entire Lost Episode event, the man in the eye patch and the pirate hat, a grown man sitting in his living room in Encino with a parrot puppet on his shoulder, talking to the camera as though he was a real person who genuinely lived for this cartoon. The whole bit had been invented out of necessity, almost by accident, when the team had needed a way to fill an extra 10 minutes of running time for a holiday special. The story of how that man came to exist, and the surprisingly careful craft that went into making him look as cheap as possible, is its own quiet chapter in the show's history. Section 5, Patchy the Pirate and the Public Access Aesthetic. The first season of SpongeBob SquarePants did something unusual. It did not have a single double-length episode. Every single broadcast was made up of 2 short 11-minute segments, stitched together with a title card in between. Bubble Stand and Ripped Pants, Tea at the Tree Dome, and Reef Blower, Pickles, and Hall Monitor. The format was tight. The episodes were quick. There were no specials, no holiday extravaganzas, no 30-minute single stories, just short, fast, simple little cartoons. That changed when the second season began. Nickelodeon, watching the show's ratings climb, asked Steven Hillenberg if he could make a Christmas special. Christmas specials had been a Nickelodeon tradition for years. They were almost always a full half-hour long, a single 22-minute story, not 2 short ones. The network wanted SpongeBob to have one too. Hillenberg had a problem. The team was used to working in short bursts. 11 minutes was their natural rhythm. Stretching a story to 22 minutes was technically possible, but it would risk slowing the pace of the show. SpongeBob worked because it was fast. A long, single, drawn-out story might lose what made the show special in the first place. So Hillenberg came up with a different approach. He would not stretch the cartoon, he would frame it. He would put a 22-minute Christmas cartoon inside a slightly larger package by adding live-action segments at the beginning, middle, and end. The cartoon itself would still be made out of normal-length pieces. The extra time would come from someone hosting the broadcast, a real person, on camera, talking directly to the audience between the cartoon segments. He thought about what kind of host would work. He wanted someone who fit the spirit of the show. Pirate-themed, since pirates were already part of the SpongeBob world. The opening theme song featured a singing pirate. A goofy, live-action pirate guy could host the the show without breaking the underwater fantasy too badly. The question of who would actually play the pirate was easy. Hillenberg wanted Tom Kenny. Kenny was already the voice of SpongeBob. Hillenberg wanted the same person to be the main face of both segments. The animated story would star a sponge, voiced by Tom Kenny. The live-action wraparound would star a man, played by Tom Kenny. The audience would be hearing the same voice through different bodies. The pirate's name was Patchy. Patchy was given a backstory. He lived in Encino, California, in a small suburban home. He had a pet parrot named Potty. He was the self-appointed president of a fictional SpongeBob SquarePants fan club. His house was filled with SpongeBob merchandise. He owned plush toys, posters, bedspreads, pillows, dishware, and pretty much every other piece of SpongeBob memorabilia you could imagine. The whole point of his character was that he was such a die-hard fan of the cartoon he hosted that the show was his entire life. He existed for SpongeBob. He spoke about SpongeBob constantly. He defended SpongeBob with a passionate, almost desperate energy. Hillenberg had a specific look in mind for Patchy. He wanted the live-action segments to feel like something else, something older, something cheaper, something that reminded people of a particular kind of television that used to exist and was already starting to disappear by the year 2000. Public access television. For decades, in cities all over America, local cable channels would set aside a few hours of airtime for community-produced programs. Sometimes these shows were religious sermons. Sometimes they were political rants from an old man with a camcorder. And sometimes, especially on weekend mornings, they were children's programs. A local guy in a costume, sitting in front of a hand-painted backdrop in some basement studio somewhere, talking to imaginary kids on the other side of the camera. These shows had no budgets. The lighting was bad, the sound was tinny, the host's costume was usually homemade. The puppets, if there were any, were built out of socks and felt and plastic eyes. The whole thing felt like something a friendly weirdo had cobbled together in his garage on the Saturday afternoon. Hillenberg loved that aesthetic. He wanted Patchy to feel like the host of a small public access children's show. A man pretending to be a pirate, broadcasting from his own living room, with a homemade parrot puppet on his shoulder and a stack of unwatched fan mail on his desk. The whole point was that the live-action segments should look as if they were made by a single, slightly off-center fan with no money. A fan who happened to also be the show's broadcaster. To pull that off, the production team had to do something most television shows never do. They had to deliberately make their work look bad. Patchy's eye patch, a small detail that any costume designer should have been able to keep consistent, was allowed to switch eyes between scenes. One shot would show Patchy with a patch over his right eye. The next would show it over his left. Real continuity errors, in normal television, are mistakes that production teams work hard to prevent. The Patchy team made them on purpose. The patch-swapping eyes was a quiet visual joke about how cheap and slapdash a public access show could be. The same was true for Patchy's hook. He had a hook for a hand, the way pirates traditionally do. The hook would sometimes appear on his right hand and sometimes on his left. Same eye patch joke applied to a different limb. Continuity errors made deliberately to evoke the look of a low-budget production where nobody was paying close attention to such things. The puppetry of Patchy the Parrot was also intentionally bad. Patchy was a string puppet. The strings that controlled him were sometimes clearly visible. The puppeteer's hand could occasionally be seen. The lip syncing was off. Patchy's beak would move at the wrong times, opening when he was not speaking and staying still when he was. This was not because the team could not do better. The crew knew exactly how to make a clean puppet. They were choosing not to. The whole point was the joke that Patchy was running this show out of his own house with whatever materials he could find. Hillenberg himself voiced Patchy in the early seasons. He sat in the recording booth and gave the parrot a sarcastic, slightly mean voice that bickered constantly with Patchy. The two of them, the pirate man and the obviously fake parrot, would argue with each other on camera while the pretend low-budget production fell apart around them. Patchy's original costume included a peg leg. Pirates traditionally had wooden peg legs, the kind that replaced a missing leg below the knee. Tom Kenny was given a peg leg to wear. The illusion was created by having Kenny wear baggy pants and bend his knee underneath them. The peg leg was attached to the bent knee. From the camera's angle, it looked like Kenny was standing on one leg and one wooden stick. This worked for the first few episodes. Then Kenny ran into a problem. Walking around with his knee bent underneath him for hours at a time was painful. His leg would cramp. His back would hurt. The whole thing was uncomfortable in a way that small visual gags often are, so the production quietly retired the peg leg. Patchy started wearing two normal boots instead, both legs visible, both feet feet on the ground. The show never explicitly addressed the change.
Patchy's leg simply healed itself between episodes, a small continuity error to add to the eye patch one and the hook one.
The team treated it as another piece of the cheap broadcast aesthetic, a man so disorganized that even his own anatomy could not stay consistent from week to week. Patchy's hook had its own production story. The original hook was made out of cardboard. The crew had spray painted the cardboard silver to make it look like metal. This worked fine for almost every situation. Then, during the production of an episode called Feral Friends, the hook got wet. Cardboard does not hold up well to water. The hook fell apart. A new one had to be made. The team chose not to upgrade to anything fancier. They simply built another cardboard hook and sprayed it silver again. A cheap replacement for a cheap original, both designed to look exactly as cheap as Patchy's whole imaginary fan club operation should look. The character grew quickly. Children loved Patchy. He became a kind of mascot for the show beyond the cartoon itself. Nickelodeon began using him in commercials, in network promotions, in transitions between shows. He hosted countdowns. He hosted marathons. He showed up during commercial breaks to remind kids what was on next. By the early 2000s, Patchy had become one of the most recognizable faces on the entire Nickelodeon network, not just on SpongeBob. Tom Kenny would later say that Patchy was his favorite secondary character on the show. The role gave him something he did not get from voice work, a chance to use his whole body, to make faces, to run around, to smash things in fits of fake rage. Voice acting is done in a sound booth, alone, in front of a microphone. Patchy let Kenny actually act, on camera, with props and costumes and other people. He loved doing it. There is a small, sweet detail hidden in Patchy's appearances. Whenever Patchy's left hand is shown in close-up on camera, you can see a wedding ring on his finger. The ring is not part of the costume. The ring belongs to Tom Kenny. Kenny is married, in real life, to an actress named Jill Talley. Talley voices Karen, the computer wife of Plankton on SpongeBob SquarePants. Two real-life spouses both work on the same cartoon. One voices the villain's wife, the other plays the live-action pirate host. The wedding ring on Patchy's finger is the small physical proof of their marriage, peeking through the costume in every close-up. Other production details accumulated over the years. Patchy's neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Johnson, became a recurring character in his segments. Mrs. Johnson would sometimes throw things through Patchy's window. She would offer him cookies. She would help him out of trouble. She had a rocket-powered wheelchair in one episode. The world of Patchy's small Encino house slowly filled itself in with little supporting characters who were all just as ridiculous as he was. The deliberate cheapness eventually became a problem. By the early 2000s, Nickelodeon's network had grown more polished. The whole network was producing slicker, more expensive-looking content. SpongeBob itself had started to look more refined. The animation quality had improved over the years. The colors were brighter. The backgrounds were more detailed. Sitting next to all that polish, Patchy's deliberately rough segments started to feel out of place. They no longer felt like a charming throwback. They started to feel, to some Nickelodeon executives, just plain bad. One executive at the network, sometime in the 2000s, voiced this concern openly. The intentional low-budget feel of Patchy's segments, the executive said, was making the entire SpongeBob show look cheap. The whole point of the look had been a kind of affectionate joke about public access television. By the 2000s, fewer kids even knew what public access television was. The joke had begun to age out of relevance. The production team responded. For a 2011 special called Legends of Bikini Bottom, the Patchy segments were given much higher production values than ever before. Better lighting, cleaner sets, more professional puppet work. The deliberately bad continuity errors were dialed back. Patchy still played the same character, still hosted the show, still got into the same kinds of fights with Potty, but the segments around him no longer looked like they were filmed in someone's basement. The change was gradual, not absolute. Patchy still has rough edges, even in his later appearances. His house still has a hand-painted, lived-in quality. He still acts as if he is broadcasting from his own home. The character never abandoned his roots entirely. He simply got dressed up a little better as the show grew. Patchy has appeared in more episodes than almost any non-main character. By every measure, he has more screen time, more lines, and more major roles than any supporting figure on the show outside the core animated cast. The writing team has actually discussed, multiple times over the years, making an episode that focuses entirely on Patchy with no animated cartoon at all. They have come close to it once. There is a special called Patchy's Playlist that was given its own production number, treating it as a real episode rather than a wraparound, but it still includes includes some animated material. Patchy also crossed over into other Nickelodeon shows. He appeared in an episode of the live-action sitcom Big Time Rush, in a special called Big Time Beach Party, where he was searching for his family's lost treasure. He is the only SpongeBob character to ever guest star in another live-action Nickelodeon series. He has even appeared on Broadway in the live recording of the SpongeBob musical released in 2019, where Tom Kenny once again played the role. The live-action concept that began as a small workaround for filling extra time in a Christmas special became something much bigger, a character whose deliberately cheap aesthetic carried decades of network history inside it. A man in a costume in a suburban living room with a sock puppet on his shoulder, hosting the most successful animated show of his lifetime, with his real-life wedding ring quietly visible in every close-up shot. Patchy was one piece of the show's strange, layered architecture, the kind of thing the SpongeBob crew did over and over throughout the show's history. They added small, weird, deliberately imperfect touches to a cartoon that was, on its surface, simple and bright and cheerful. Hillenberg loved hidden depths. He loved building things that looked one way and worked another way underneath. He had built Bikini Bottom on top of a real nuclear test site. He had built a goofy pirate host on top of a tribute to forgotten regional television. He had built the entire show on top of a rejected educational comic book. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He had also built one specific character with a hidden depth that almost nobody noticed when the show first aired. A character who appeared in the pilot. A character who lived in a stone head between SpongeBob and Patrick. A character whose grumpy, miserable, artistic but untalented presence would slowly become one of the strangest and most quietly heartbreaking creations in the history of the show. A character whose original name was nearly something else entirely, and whose actual species had to be reduced from 8 legs to 6 because of a small but very real problem with how cartoons get drawn. Section 6. Squidward was never supposed to be funny. The character lives in a stone head. His house, sitting on Conch Street between SpongeBob's pineapple and Patrick's rock, is shaped like one of those giant stone heads you sometimes see in pictures of Easter Island. The technical name for those stone figures is moai. They are ancient. They are mysterious. They were carved by a small population on a remote Pacific island hundreds of years ago, and nobody is entirely sure why. Many of them face inland, watching over the people who live there. Squidward's home is one of those. The choice is quiet, but it tells you something about him before you ever hear him speak. SpongeBob lives inside a fruit, bright and tropical and full of childlike whimsy. Patrick lives under a rock, plain and unbothered and slightly ridiculous. Squidward lives inside a piece of ancient art, a monument, a serious thing. He has decided, somewhere deep down, that he is the kind of person who deserves to live inside a sculpture. Steven Hillenberg designed Squidward early in the development of the show. The character was already in the original pitch. He was already in the pilot. The first episode, Help Wanted, gave Squidward a real role. The cashier at the Krusty Krab, the grumpy neighbor, the third most important character in the whole thing. Hillenberg picked the species deliberately. He had been thinking about what kind of sea creature should serve as SpongeBob's grumpy neighbor. He wanted something with a particular shape, something with a large, round head, something that could carry the visual joke of looking smarter than the people around it. He landed on the octopus. Octopuses, Hillenberg said in DVD commentary years later, have a large, bulbous head. Squidward thinks of himself as an intellectual, so of course, Squidward should have a large, bulbous head. The shape of the character would do half the joke for you. A snobby creature with a big, brain-shaped skull, surrounded by simpler, smaller-headed friends. There was a problem with the name, though. If the character was an octopus, the natural choice for his name would have been something octopus-related. Hillenberg and the team tossed around the obvious option, Octoward, a grumpy octopus named Octoward. The voice actor who would eventually play him, Roger Bumpus, said years later that Octoward simply did not work. The name sounded clunky. It did not roll off the tongue. It did not feel like the name of a person you could imagine actually existing. So the team made a small, sneaky compromise. The character would be an octopus in design and biology, but his name would come from a different sea creature, a creature closely related to the octopus, a squid. Squids and octopuses are cousins. They both belong to a larger group of animals that includes cuttlefish and nautiluses. They share many traits. The squid has 10 limbs, while the octopus has 8. They both squirt ink. They both have large heads. They both move through the water in similar ways. Hillenberg combined combined the squid name with the human name Edward. Squid plus Edward. Squidward. The name had a friendlier sound. It sounded like a real name. It hinted at the character's snooty, slightly old-fashioned personality. Edward is the kind of name that imagines itself as classy and refined, which fit the character perfectly. So Squidward was born with a contradiction inside his name. His species was octopus. His name suggested squid. The two parts did not match. Hillenberg liked it that way. He liked small, hidden errors that the audience could discover later. The fact that Squidward, even on a basic biological level, was something other than what his name suggested was a quiet little joke baked into the foundation of the character. The team faced another problem, a practical one, an animation problem. Octopuses have 8 limbs, 2 arms and 6 legs in Squidward's case. If you added up everything an octopus is supposed to have, you got 8 tentacles total. The animators tried to draw the character that way at first. They very quickly ran into trouble. 8 tentacles is a lot of tentacles to track in animation. Every limb has to move. Every limb has to be drawn in every single frame. Animation moves at 24 frames per second. That means 24 drawings per second of screen time, with each drawing requiring all 8 limbs to be in the correct position relative to each other. The cost in time and labor was enormous. Whenever Squidward walked, danced, sat down, or moved in any way, the animators had to keep 8 separate body parts visually consistent. Hillenberg made a small executive decision. Squidward would be drawn with 6 tentacles instead of 8, 2 arms and 4 legs. The animators could keep up with that. The character would be slightly anatomically incorrect, but the audience would not really notice or care. This is canon. Hillenberg confirmed the choice himself in DVD commentary for the first SpongeBob movie. He said it was just simpler for animation purposes. 6 legs instead of 8. There are exactly 2 episodes in the entire run of the show where Squidward is drawn with all 8 legs. The first is the live-action sequence in a Season 2 episode called Pressure. There is a brief moment where Squidward appears in real-world footage as a small photographed octopus model. That model has the correct number of limbs. The second exception is in a Season 9 episode called Sold, where for a few quick frames, Squidward briefly has 8 legs visible. Outside those 2 moments, every single appearance of Squidward across hundreds of episodes uses 6 tentacles. Bumpus, his voice actor, has joked about this in interviews. The character's name says squid, his body says octopus, his leg count says simplified for animation cartoon character. Squidward exists in a strange space where almost nothing about him quite adds up to anything biologically real. The crew kept finding more small details to refine. Hillenberg originally wanted to use a running joke involving Squidward's ink. Real octopuses can squirt ink as a defense mechanism. They release a black cloud into the water to confuse predators and escape. Hillenberg thought it would be funny if Squidward, when scared or surprised or embarrassed, would accidentally release ink. The team actually drew this in early concept art. They tested how it would look on screen. The result was a problem. Hillenberg looked at the animated ink coming out of the back of Squidward's body and said something specific. He said it always looked like Squidward was, in his exact words, pooping his pants. The visual reading was unavoidable. A character standing upright, releasing dark fluid from his lower half, simply did not communicate ink. It communicated something else. Something the show very much did not want to communicate to children. The ink jokes were retired. Squidward would not be releasing ink as a regular character feature. The gag would be reserved for very specific later episodes where it could be set up properly. There is a Season 9 episode called Giant Squidward, where ink does come into play. There is also a much later episode called Ink Lemonade, where Patrick attempts to harvest Squidward's ink for a beverage. But these were exceptions. The general rule was that Squidward simply did not do that particular octopus thing. Hillenberg's instinct that the visual would always read wrong kept the gag off stage for almost the entire run of the show. Other small choices added themselves to the character over time. The sound of Squidward's footsteps is a specific sound, a wet, sucking, squelchy sound, like rubber pulling away from glass. The show's Foley team, the people who create sound effects by recording real-world objects, came up with a clever way to produce this. They used hot water bottles. The team would press hot water bottles against various surfaces and record the resulting sound. The squelching of the rubber against the surface, slowed down or sped up, became the sound of Squidward walking. Every time you hear his suction cup feet on the floor of the Krusty Krab, you are hearing rubber water bottles bottles being pressed against something in a recording booth. Then there was the bicycle. In several episodes, Squidward rides a strange-looking bicycle, the kind of bicycle where the rider sits low to the ground and pedals with their legs stretched out in front of them. This is called a recumbent bicycle. It is a real thing. People ride them in real life. They are unusual, but not rare. The reason Squidward rides one of these comes from a real place. Roger Bumpus, the voice actor, owns a recumbent bicycle in real life. He rides one around his neighborhood in Burbank, California. He suggested giving Squidward the same kind of bike as a small inside joke. The writers liked the idea. They added it to Squidward's character. Now, whenever Squidward rides a bicycle in the show, he rides the same kind that his voice actor rides at home. A small, secret crossover between the actor and the character. Bumpus himself shaped the character in another important way. The original concept for Squidward was a fairly flat one. A nasal, monotone, miserable creature. A character whose only note was being annoyed all the time. Bumpus took that and added something to it. He gave Squidward a wider emotional range. He found ways to perform sarcasm that built into frustration. He found ways for frustration to escalate into something close to hysteria. He gave Squidward a wide vocabulary of misery. There is the dry, bored Squidward, the seething, barely contained Squidward, the wailing, broken down Squidward, the brief, accidental, almost tender Squidward. Bumpus mapped out a whole landscape of emotional states that the original character design did not require. Vincent Waller, the show's creative director and one of its writers, has said in interviews that Squidward is one of the hardest characters in the entire show to draw. The strange shape of his head, with its two large bulges and the pinched features in the middle, makes facial expressions difficult. His emotions, Waller said, tend to be even and flat by default. Getting big, expressive emotion out of him takes real work. The animators have to push the design hard. They have to stretch and squash his face in ways the design does not naturally allow. The character is designed to be reserved and contained. Making him explode visually when the story calls for it requires effort that other characters do not. Squidward also has a full family tree, slowly built up across the show's run. He has a mother named Mrs. Tentacles. He has a father named Jeff. He has a paternal grandmother called Granny Tentacles. He has ancestors going back many generations. There is a great-great-great-grandfather named Tentacles the Serpent Slayer. There is a Victorian-era ancestor, a medieval ancestor, an Arabian ancestor, a prehistoric ancestor named Squog, even a dinosaur ancestor named Squidosaurus rex. The show has slowly filled in the family with absurd, time-spanning relatives. The whole tree exists, mostly, to set up jokes about how long Squidward's family has been miserable. His real species, by the way, was finally confirmed in a season 12 episode called Feral Friends. He is a giant Pacific octopus, a real type of octopus, the largest octopus species on Earth. They live in the cold waters off the Pacific coast of North America. They can grow to weigh more than 100 pounds. They are intelligent. They are solitary. They live alone, mostly, in dens carved into rocks. A solitary, intelligent creature who lives alone inside a stone monument, surrounded by neighbors he cannot stand. The species fits. Squidward had been built. The cast had filled out around him. The show was running. The world of Bikini Bottom was alive on television screens across the country. Episodes were piling up, season after season. New characters were being added. Old jokes were being refined. The crew was producing dozens of cartoons a year. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But not every episode that got made would stay on television. A small handful, over the course of the show's long run, would air once or twice and then quietly vanish from the schedule. Some would be edited, some would be shelved, some would be pulled entirely. Real episodes, with real production codes and real broadcast dates, that the network would eventually decide could no longer be shown. Section 7. The 3 episodes that disappeared. Most of what people online call lost episodes of SpongeBob are not real. They're stories. They're fan fiction. They're creepy little tales that some bored teenager wrote in the early 2000s and posted to a website. The most famous of these is called Squidward's Suicide. Another is called Red Mist. Both stories pretend to describe horrifying secret episodes of the show, supposedly leaked from an old VHS tape or stumbled across by an animator. Neither of them is real. Neither of them ever existed. Nickelodeon never produced them. Hillenberg never wrote them. They are made-up internet horror stories, the same way ghost stories around a campfire are made up. They have nothing to do with the actual production history of SpongeBob SquarePants. What does exist twist is much smaller, much quieter, and much more interesting. There are exactly 3 episodes in the real history of the show that were genuinely pulled, censored, or shelved. Each one has a documented reason. Each one was discussed openly by the people who made the show, and each one tells a small story about how cartoons interact with real-world events. The first of them is from very early in the show's run. The episode is called Just One Bite. It aired on Nickelodeon for the first time on October 5th, 2001. It is a season 3 episode. The plot is simple. SpongeBob discovers that his coworker Squidward has never tried a Krabby Patty. SpongeBob, in his usual cheerful way, becomes obsessed with getting Squidward to try one. Squidward refuses for most of the episode. He claims he hates them. He pretends he is above them. By the end, of course, it turns out Squidward secretly loves them. He sneaks back into the Krusty Krab at night to eat them in private. SpongeBob discovers his secret. The episode ends with the usual gentle comedy. There is a scene in the middle of the episode that does not exist in most of the versions you can watch today. In the original broadcast, Squidward sneaks into the Krusty Krab after closing to steal a patty. Mr. Krabs, suspicious that Plankton might try to break in at night, has installed a security system. The system is, in classic SpongeBob style, ridiculous. It involves a bucket of gasoline. Squidward accidentally triggers the bucket. The gasoline spills onto the floor. A match drops. The whole thing ignites. Squidward is engulfed in flames. The explosion plays out for a full beat. Then a second explosion happens. The whole sequence is treated as physical comedy. Squidward is unharmed in the long run, the way cartoon characters always are. The fire is a gag, not a horror moment, but the sequence is intense. Real flames, real gasoline, a real bucket, and a real match. The episode aired with that scene intact on October 5th, 2001. The world had changed 3 weeks earlier. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 had happened just under a month before that broadcast. 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center in New York. The towers had collapsed. Thousands of people had died. America was still reeling. Every studio in Hollywood was reviewing its content, looking for anything that might feel insensitive. Movies with explosions were being delayed. Television shows were being recut. A massive wave of self-censorship was rippling through every major network. After the first broadcast, the gasoline scene was quietly removed from Just One Bite. Future airings of the episode skipped over it entirely. The version released on DVD a couple of years later also had the scene cut out. The same was true for streaming releases. For years, fans assumed the cut was directly because of September 11th. The timing seemed obvious. A scene with 2 explosions, removed within weeks of an attack that had involved 2 collapsing towers. The connection felt unavoidable. The actual reason was a little more complicated. A writer on the episode named Jay Lender, in a 2007 interview with the fan website SpongeBuddyMania, said that the cut was the result of multiple factors. He said the scene had originally been approved through every level of Nickelodeon's review process. It had been checked, rechecked, approved, and animated. The September 11th attacks were one element in the eventual decision to remove the scene. He said the September 11th environment had played a major role. Years later, in 2018, the show's then-current showrunner, Vincent Waller, offered a slightly different explanation. Waller said the cut had been driven mostly by Standards and Practices. Standards and Practices is the department at every American network that reviews content for safety and appropriateness. Their main concern, Waller said, had been the depiction of children-replicable behavior. A cartoon character lighting gasoline on fire was, in their view, a bad thing for children to see. Kids might try to copy it. The network did not want a child accidentally burning down a house because they had seen Squidward do it. Both explanations are probably true. The scene had passed approval before September 11th. Something changed afterward. The official reason given was Standards and Practices. The unofficial timing was hard to ignore. The uncut version of Just One Bite still exists. It is preserved in some international broadcasts. The Canadian channel YTV continued to air the original version with the gasoline scene intact for years. Korean broadcasts of the episode also kept the scene. The unedited version is also dubbed in other languages and survives in foreign DVD releases. The second pulled episode is from much later in the show's history. The episode is called Midlife Crustacean. It aired on January 24th, 2003. It is the second segment of the 15th episode of Season 3. The plot is gentle and weirdly sad. Mr. Krabs wakes up one morning feeling old. A song on his clock radio reminds him of his age. His daughter Pearl confirms that yes, he is old. He spends the day getting more depressed about it. By the the time he reaches the Krusty Krab, he is desperate to feel young again. He overhears SpongeBob and Patrick planning a big night out. He asks if he can come along. They invite him. The night begins. SpongeBob and Patrick take Mr. Krabs through a series of activities. Most of them are childish. Some of them are simply weird. Mr. Krabs grows more frustrated as the night continues. None of these activities are making him feel young. He had expected something exciting and adult. He is getting silly games and bland fun. Then Patrick reveals what they have been building toward. The grand finale of the night, in his words, is something called a panty raid. The group sneaks into a woman's house at night and steals a piece of her underwear from her dresser drawer. Mr. Krabs, who had been miserable up until this moment, suddenly perks up. He is excited. He goes along with it. The group breaks into the house. They grab the underwear. They run. The woman they have stolen from turns out to be Mr. Krabs' own mother. She catches them in the act. She is furious. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs being grounded. The episode aired and ran in normal rotation for 15 years. In 2018, Nickelodeon quietly pulled it from the air. The network did not announce the decision publicly at the time. The episode simply stopped showing up in the broadcast schedule. Fans noticed it was missing. Eventually, in 2021, when the streaming service Paramount Plus also dropped the episode from its catalog, journalists asked Nickelodeon for a reason. A network spokesperson named David Bitler explained the decision in a statement to the New York Times. He said the episode had been out of rotation since 2018 following a standards review. He said the network had determined that some story elements were not appropriate for children. The network did not specify which story elements. Most observers assumed the panty raid scene was the reason. The cultural conversation around women's safety, especially during the years of the Me Too movement, which began in 2017, had shifted significantly since 2003. A cartoon for children that included a scene of 3 male characters breaking into a woman's home to steal her underwear felt much more uncomfortable in 2018 than it had in 2003. The episode was pulled from streaming in 2021. It returned briefly in 2023 when a technical error on Amazon's Paramount Plus channel made it temporarily available. Paramount removed it again as soon as the error was discovered. As of recent years, the episode has been quietly restored to most platforms, but it remains a notable example of an episode that aired normally for years and was then removed when the cultural moment changed around it. The third pulled episode is the strangest of the 3 because it had nothing to do with content choices. It was pulled because of timing. The episode is called Quarantined Crab. It is from season 12. It was scheduled to air on April 4th, 2020. The plot involves a health inspector arriving at the Krusty Krab and announcing that someone in the restaurant is carrying a contagious disease called the clam flu. The whole place is placed under quarantine. The doors are locked. Nobody is allowed in or out. The customers and staff are forced to remain inside until the sick person is identified. Mr. Krabs proposes that any sick person should be locked in the freezer. Various characters get accused of being sick and locked in the freezer one by one. The episode ends with a comedic twist where the sickness turns out to be something else entirely. The episode had been written more than a year earlier, sometime in 2018 or 2019. The writers had no idea what was about to happen in the real world. The COVID-19 pandemic began spreading globally in early 2020. By March of that year, much of the world was under actual lockdown. Real businesses were closing. Real people were being quarantined. The word quarantine was suddenly part of daily life. A children's cartoon airing in April 2020 about a fast food restaurant being placed under emergency quarantine because of a contagious illness was, by any measure, unfortunate timing. Nickelodeon pulled the episode. A network statement explained the decision simply. The episode centered on a virus storyline, the network said, and they had decided not to air it because of sensitivities surrounding the global, real-world pandemic. The episode sat on a shelf for 2 years. It eventually aired on April 29th, 2022, more than 2 years after its originally scheduled premiere date. The season 12 DVD set, released while the episode was still being held back, did not include it. To this day, Quarantined Crab is the only SpongeBob episode that was never included on a complete season home video release. The DVD is missing a piece. These 3 episodes, Just One Bite with its gasoline scene, Midlife Crustacean, and Quarantined Crab, are the entire real list of pulled or significantly censored SpongeBob episodes in the show's history. They are not lost. They are not horror stories. They are not secret tapes hidden in vaults. They are normal episodes that aired, were reviewed, continued and were pulled or trimmed by people doing their jobs. The actual missing material is small, smaller than the internet legends suggest. A scene with a bucket of gasoline, a subplot about underwear, an entire episode about a fictional flu. Each one was pulled for reasons that, if you read the documents and the interviews, are perfectly ordinary. Network standards, cultural shifts, real-world tragedies that made fictional gags feel inappropriate. The world of the show kept moving forward around these absences. New episodes kept being made. New characters kept being introduced. The cast at the top of the show stayed mostly the same year after year. The voices everybody recognized. The actors whose work had been there from the start. Most of those actors are still alive and still recording. 2 of them are not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 2 voices belong to 2 old men, 2 comedy legends from the 1960s who had reunited on SpongeBob in 1999 for their first joint television project in more than 3 decades. Their characters were SpongeBob's favorite superheroes. Their deaths, years apart, would change how those superheroes were used on the show forever. Section 8. Mermaid Man, Barnacle Boy, and 2 real deaths. In the world of SpongeBob SquarePants, there are 2 old men in spandex who once saved Bikini Bottom from monsters. They wear capes, they have catchphrases, they have a hideout called the Mermaid hidden underneath their nursing home, with a secret entrance you reach by pressing a button under the couch. They have an enemy called Man Ray, and another enemy called the Dirty Bubble. They have a small sidekick relationship that has been worn down by decades of bickering. They are, in the show, real superheroes, the kind that actually fought crime back in their younger days, the kind that retired when their bodies got too tired to keep going. Their names are Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. They live, in the SpongeBob universe, at a place called the Shady Shoals Rest Home. They watch television, they eat pudding, they forget things, they argue. They are SpongeBob and Patrick's favorite characters in the entire world. The 2 of them grew up watching the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy show on television and remain absolutely devoted to it as adults. The story of how those 2 characters came to be on SpongeBob and the story of how they slowly disappeared from it is one of the most genuinely tender chapters in the show's history. The whole thing began with 2 old comedy legends. Ernest Borgnine was an American actor with one of the longest careers in Hollywood history. He had been making movies and television since the 1940s. He had won an Academy Award in 1955 for a film called Marty, where he played a lonely butcher in the Bronx. He had been in dozens of westerns and war movies and dramas. He had a face that audiences loved, a wide, expressive face with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. By the late 1990s, he was in his 80s. He was still working, but he was no longer the leading man he had once been. Tim Conway was a comedian. He had spent the 1960s and 1970s as one of the most beloved sketch comics in America. He had become famous on a sitcom called McHale's Navy, which ran from 1962 to 1966. He had spent 11 years on The Carol Burnett Show, where he became known for making the entire cast break character with his improvised gags. He was a small man with a soft voice and a gift for slow, deliberate building comedy. Borgnine and Conway had worked together on McHale's Navy in the 1960s. The show was set on a Navy boat during the Second World War. Borgnine played the commander. Conway played a bumbling officer who could never get anything right. The 2 of them had a chemistry that audiences loved. Borgnine's barking authority crashing into Conway's quiet, helpless confusion. Their comic partnership was one of the great pairings of 1960s television. After McHale's Navy ended, the 2 of them went their separate ways. Borgnine continued making movies. Conway continued doing sketch comedy. They occasionally appeared together on talk shows or specials, but they never starred together in a regular project again. For 33 years, they had not done a joint television show. Stephen Hillenberg and Derek Dryman were fans of McHale's Navy. They had grown up watching it. When they began designing the cast of SpongeBob SquarePants in the late 1990s, they decided they wanted to do something special with the senior superhero characters they had created. SpongeBob's favorite TV heroes were going to be old. They were going to be retired. They were going to be living in a nursing home. The whole joke of the characters was that they were superheroes who had aged out of being able to do the job properly, but the children of Bikini Bottom still worshipped them anyway. Hillenberg and Dryman decided they wanted Borgnine and Conway, the first choice, the dream pairing. They wanted the McHale's Navy chemistry, 33 years older, brought back together for a children's cartoon. They reached out directly. They contacted Borgnine. They contacted Conway. They explained the project. Both men agreed. The recording sessions began. There is a small story about how Mermaid Man's signature catchphrase came to exist. The character has one word that he yells louder than any other word in the entire show. The word is evil. He yells it whenever the topic of crime or villainy comes up. The voice cracks. It breaks. It rattles in a way that sounds almost involuntary, like a real old man losing control of his volume. That voice crack was an accident. Borgnine, during one of his early recording sessions, was trying out the voice for Mermaid Man. He was reading a line that contained the word evil. As he yelled it, his voice cracked unexpectedly. He had not meant to do it. The microphone caught it. The producers in the booth heard it. They loved it. Borgnine, in an interview years later with the Archive of American Television, said something simple about that moment. He said, "By golly, we started something. They kept it in." Every time you hear Mermaid Man yell evil with that strangled, broken-voiced intensity, you are hearing a real moment of a real old man's voice cracking by accident in a recording booth, preserved in the show forever. Borgnine appeared in 16 episodes as Mermaid Man over the years. That is more guest star appearances than any other actor in the entire history of SpongeBob SquarePants. The character grew. He became a recurring fixture. SpongeBob and Patrick would visit the rest home. They would beg Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy to come out of retirement. They would steal Mermaid Man's belt. They would ask for autographs. They would attend Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy events. Borgnine, by all accounts, loved the work. He had become famous decades earlier playing tough guys and serious dramatic roles. Now, in his 80s, he was getting fan mail from children. Kids who had never seen him in a single one of his old movies were recognizing his voice in supermarkets. He had developed an entirely new audience, an audience of 7-year-olds who knew him only as the loud old superhero with the mask. He passed away on July 8th, 2012. The cause of death was kidney failure. He was 95 years old. His career had spanned nearly 70 years. His final television role had been the voice of Mermaid Man. Nickelodeon honored him with a 2-hour SpongeBob marathon featuring the episodes that focused on his character. The network ran them back to back as a quiet tribute. Fans, many of whom were now adults who had grown up on the show, watched. The character of Mermaid Man did not disappear after Borgnine's death. He remained part of the show, but Hillenberg made an executive decision. He chose not to recast the role. He would not hire a new actor to imitate Borgnine's voice. The character would still appear, but his speaking parts would be reduced almost to nothing. Sometimes Mermaid Man would have a single short line. Sometimes he would have no lines at all and would simply stand in the background of a scene. Sometimes other characters would put on Mermaid Man costumes and pretend to be him, like SpongeBob himself, or a recurring side character named Larry the Lobster. The original recordings Borgnine had made over the years would occasionally be reused. A line he had recorded for one episode might be edited into a different episode after his death, but no new dialogue would ever be created. When Borgnine's voice was finished, it was finished. Conway continued voicing Barnacle Boy for years afterward. Barnacle Boy still spoke. Barnacle Boy still appeared in episodes. The character continued to function in the show, even as his older partner faded into silence. Then, in 2018, the show's then current head, Vincent Waller, posted something on Twitter that confirmed something fans had begun to suspect. Waller wrote that Tim Conway was having difficulty recording his lines because of health problems. The aging actor was struggling. The recording process had become hard for him. Conway had actually retired from acting completely in 2016, 2 years earlier, though the public had not been told the specific reason at the time. Conway died on May 14th, 2019. He was 85 years old. The cause of death was a condition called normal pressure hydrocephalus, a brain condition that affects older adults. The two original voices of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy were both gone. Hillenberg's policy continued. The show would not recast either character. Both Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy became, by quiet decision, non-speaking characters. Their appearances after the deaths of their actors are silent. They stand in scenes, they wave, they participate in plots, but they almost never speak. When dialogue is absolutely required, the lines either come from old archival recordings or from other characters wearing the costumes. There is one exception that is worth mentioning, because it shows how the show found ways to keep these voices alive in a respectful way. In 2020, a video game called SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated was released. The game was a remake of an older 2003 game. Many of the voice actors returned to record new dialogue for the new version, but Tim Conway had passed away the year before. The producers wanted Barnacle Boy to be in the game. They needed a way to include him without recasting. They went into the audio archives. Conway had recorded enough lines as Barnacle Boy over the years that the producers could pull together a full performance performance for the game using only existing recordings. They cut and combined his old dialogue. They built new scenes out of pieces of his old voice work. Conway, in this small way, gave one final performance as Barnacle Boy, more than a year after his death, made entirely from recordings he had given while he was still alive. It was Conway's first posthumous role. The word posthumous means after death. The recordings had been made by a living man. The performance had been assembled by editors after he was gone. The game was, in a quiet way, a final goodbye. There were also a few episodes during the show's run that played with the youthful versions of these characters. In a Season 7 episode called Back to the Past, SpongeBob and Patrick travel through time to the 1960s and meet Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy in their prime. The young versions were voiced by two other actors. Adam West, the actor who had played Batman in the famous 1960s television series, voiced young Mermaid Man. Burt Ward, who had played Robin in the same series, voiced young Barnacle Boy. The casting was a tribute. West and Ward had been the most famous superhero pair on television in the same era when McHale's Navy had been popular. Putting them in as the young versions of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy was a small love letter from the SpongeBob crew to the entire history of campy, costumed, golden age superhero television. Adam West himself passed away in 2017. Burt Ward is still alive at this point. The story of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy on SpongeBob is, in the end, a story about real people. Two comedy legends in their twilight years getting one last great character. Two old friends from the 1960s reunited for one final shared project, performing weekly for an audience of children who did not know the rest of their careers. Two voices recorded over many years and then gradually preserved in silence after their owners passed away. The decision not to recast either of them was a quiet act of respect. The show's creators believed that some voices simply should not be replaced. The Krusty Krab kept frying its patties. SpongeBob kept living his life. The show kept moving forward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there is one mystery embedded in the very heart of the show that has never been fully solved. A mystery about a single object, a small glass bottle. A bottle that holds, supposedly, the most important secret in all of Bikini Bottom. A recipe nobody has ever fully read. A formula whose actual ingredients have been hidden from audiences and from rival businesses for the entire run of the show. The truth about what is in that bottle is stranger and quieter than most viewers ever realized. Section 9. The Krabby Patty has no meat, and other quiet rules of Bikini Bottom. Sitting on a shelf inside a small safe at the Krusty Krab is a glass bottle. The bottle is light blue, almost transparent, with a cork stopper at the top. Inside the bottle is a single rolled up piece of paper. On the paper is a recipe. The recipe is the most valuable secret in all of Bikini Bottom. Its real ingredients have been hidden from the audience, from the other characters in the show, and from the show's most determined villain for more than 2 decades. The recipe is for the Krabby Patty. The Krabby Patty is, on the surface, just a cheeseburger. It is a sandwich made of 2 buns with a patty in the middle. It has cheese, lettuce, onions, tomatoes, ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, and pickles. The order of these ingredients was actually shown to viewers in a Season 1 episode called Pickles, where SpongeBob carefully assembled a Krabby Patty in front of the camera, and the audience saw the components stacked one by one. Most of those ingredients are normal fast food fare. Most of them are not the secret. The secret is the patty itself. What is the patty made of? What is in it? Why does it taste so good? Plankton, the show's tiny green villain, has spent the entire series trying to find out. He has launched scheme after scheme to steal the recipe. He has disguised himself as customers. He has sent miniature robots into the restaurant. He has hypnotized SpongeBob. He has built a time machine. He has crawled inside Mr. Krabs' body. Every plan fails. The recipe stays inside its bottle. The bottle stays inside its safe. Most viewers, watching the show as children, probably assumed the patty was made of beef. The Krabby Patty looks like a hamburger. The Krusty Krab looks like a fast food restaurant. Mr. Krabs cooks the patties on a flat grill, the same way burger joints in the real world cook beef. The visual cues all point to one conclusion. It is a burger. Burgers are made of meat. The patty is not made of meat. This was confirmed publicly by Vincent Waller, the show's creative director and one of its writers, in a series of comments and interviews over the years. Waller has stated, plainly, that there is absolutely no meat in the Krabby Patty. There is no animal product in there at all. The ingredient at the center of the most eaten food in the entire SpongeBob universe is, by writer's room rule, vegetarian. This was always Stephen Hillenberg's intention. He decided early on, during the show's creation, that the Krabby Patty would not contain meat. He never wanted it to. The show writers have been bound by this rule for the entire run of the series. Mr. Lawrence, one of the show's writers, and the actor who voices Plankton, has explained the reasoning in greater detail in interviews. He has said that the show has a specific writer's rule about food. Fish, in the world of SpongeBob, cannot eat other fish. The characters of Bikini Bottom are themselves sea creatures. They are sponges, starfish, octopuses, crabs, whales, squirrels, and other underwater beings. Having those characters eat each other, or eat other species of sea life, would create a strange and uncomfortable dynamic. The writers have chosen to avoid it. This is why the Krusty Krab serves what it serves. Lawrence has stated that there is no meat being served anywhere in Bikini Bottom, with one specific exception. The exception is the Chum Bucket, Plankton's failing rival restaurant, which sits across the street from the Krusty Krab and almost never has any customers, serves something called chum. Chum, in real-world terms, is the ground-up bait that fishermen throw into the water to attract fish. In the show, chum appears to be made of meat, or at least made of something animal-based. It is the only meat product in the entire Bikini Bottom food economy, and it is also, in the show, considered nearly inedible. Customers who eat at the Chum Bucket have to be hospitalized to have their stomachs pumped. So the Krabby Patty, the most beloved food in Bikini Bottom, has no meat. The competing food, chum, is made of meat, and the meat-based food is treated as poison. The food economy of the show is built, quietly, around vegetarianism. The animals are not eating other animals. The villain's food is the only one that breaks this rule, and it is also the only one that makes people sick. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, has joked publicly about what the Krabby Patty actually is. In one interview, he said, with a smile, that Krabby Patties are hummus. Hummus is a real food made of mashed chickpeas. Whether or not Kenny was being literal about this, the joke captures the spirit of the writer's rule. Whatever the patty is, it is not what it looks like. Some fans have suggested an even simpler reading of the secret formula. They have argued that there is no actual secret recipe at all. The whole thing might be a marketing trick. Mr. Krabs is famously cheap. He is willing to do almost anything to save a few cents. A writer for the website Hollywood.com once suggested that the entire mythology of the secret formula could be a ruse Mr. Krabs invented to keep Plankton focused on stealing it. As long as Plankton believes there is a magical secret recipe, he will spend all his energy trying to steal it. He will not focus on actually improving his own restaurant or developing his own recipes. The secret formula, in this reading, exists primarily to distract the rival into wasting his life. The bottle and the recipe are real, though, in the show. They have been seen on screen. Multiple episodes confirm that the recipe physically exists. The location of the recipe shifts across the show's history. In one Season 5 episode called Plankton's Army, Squidward casually mentions that the formula can be found at Mr. Krabs' house, hidden underneath his mattress. This was not the secure storage solution most viewers expected. From later episodes onward, the formula is shown to live inside a safe at the Krusty Krab itself. The safe has security features. It has a combination lock. It has, in some episodes, multiple layers, including booby traps. A Season 12 episode called Friendiversary added a strange new wrinkle to the lore. In that episode, it is revealed that SpongeBob is actually the only person who knows the combination to unlock the safe. He had attached the combination to one of his memories of a friendship moment with Squidward, on the theory that he would never forget such a treasured memory. When that specific memory was accidentally erased from SpongeBob's brain in the same episode, he forgot the combination too. The recipe, locked behind a number that exists only in one sponge's emotional history, became unreachable to everybody. The villain Plankton has tried hundreds of schemes to get the bottle. The 2004 SpongeBob SquarePants movie devoted a running joke to this. Plankton's evil plan, in the movie, is referred to as Plan Z. Plan Z is the most evil of all his plans, because it is the one that finally works for him for a brief period. Earlier plans, plans A through Y, had all failed before. Plankton had filled 25 folders with 25 different schemes. None of them worked. Plan Z is the 26th and supposedly final attempt. The list of failed plans is a small canon detail. Plan B was to sneak into the Krusty Krab and steal the recipe by hand. Plan W was to build build mechanical limbs onto a Krabby Patty and ride it out of the restaurant like a horse. The list goes on, growing more and more absurd. The recipe also drives the plots of all 3 SpongeBob movies. In the 2004 film, Plankton uses Plan Z to frame Mr. Krabs and steal the formula. In the 2015 film, the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water, the recipe is stolen by a pirate named Burger Beard, played by Antonio Banderas, who wants to use it to build his own restaurant on dry land. In the 2020 film, the SpongeBob movie Sponge on the Run, the recipe again becomes a major plot point. Across all 3 films, the bottle is the engine that drives the story, the thing everybody wants, the thing that must not be lost. A few specific ingredients in the Krabby Patty have been revealed over the years through casual mentions in different episodes. A season 7 episode called The Great Patty Caper confirmed 3 ingredients. The patty contains flour, it contains barnacle shavings, it contains turmeric, which is a real spice that gives food a yellow color. None of these are particularly secret on their own. None of them are meat. All of them point toward the patty being some kind of seasoned vegetable-based or grain-based food, the same way a real-world veggie burger might be made. A 2024 stage musical event called SpongeBob on Parade added one more confirmed ingredient. Plankton learns in that show that salt is one of the components of the recipe. Again, ordinary. Again, not animal-based. Hillenberg's commitment to keeping the patty meat-free was so strong that he objected publicly to real-world marketing tie-ins that violated the spirit of his rule. In 2024, the fast food chain Wendy's launched a partnership with Nickelodeon for the show's 25th anniversary. Wendy's offered a limited-time Krabby Patty burger as a special menu item. The promotion ran from October 8th to November 11th of that year. The burger was sold alongside fries and a special pineapple and vanilla-flavored Frosty drink, billed as a pineapple under the sea Frosty. Some fans were unhappy with the promotion. Hillenberg, while he was alive, had specifically opposed the use of his characters to market food to children. He had also intended the Krabby Patty to be vegetarian. The Wendy's version of the burger used the chain's signature square beef patties. The promotion put real beef into a sandwich whose creator had spent decades insisting it should never contain meat. Hillenberg was no longer alive to publicly protest. The promotion went forward anyway. The rule about the patty being vegetarian sits next to other quiet rules the show follows. The cheapness of Mr. Krabs is treated as a real character flaw, not just a comedy bit. The episode The Patty Caper from season 6 has Mr. Krabs framing SpongeBob for stealing the secret ingredient, just so Mr. Krabs can avoid paying $1.98 for a delivery fee. He is willing to ruin his employee's life over less than $2. The show takes his greed seriously, even when it plays it for laughs. The world of Bikini Bottom has its own internal logic. The food rules, the friendship rules, the greedy boss who actually behaves like a sociopath when nobody is watching, the villain who has been failing for decades, the cheerful sponge who never realizes how badly the people around him sometimes treat each other. All of this exists inside a cartoon that, on the surface, seems like nothing more than a sponge frying burgers in a goofy underwater town. Hillenberg built it that way on purpose, the simple surface hiding a more complicated structure underneath. He had been building the show that way from the very beginning, from the rejected comic book in 1989, from the pitch in 1997, from the legal disaster with the Sponge Boy name, from the live-action pirate host, from the careful design of every character, from the secret nuclear test site origin of Bikini Bottom itself. He had been the steady hand at the center of all of it, the man making the choices, the man approving every script, the man holding the reins of a show that was, by the early 2000s, becoming one of the biggest cultural phenomena in American television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In 2004, Hillenberg made a decision that almost nobody saw coming. After years of running the show, after dozens of episodes and countless creative battles, he decided he was finished. The show, in his view, had reached its natural ending point. He wanted to walk away. The story of why he tried to end SpongeBob, why the network would not let him, and what happened to him afterward is the story that brings everything else to a close. Section 10. Hillenberg tried to end it. In 2004, by the year 2002, SpongeBob SquarePants had completed its 3rd season. 60 episodes were in the books. The show was a hit. The merchandise was selling. The ratings were enormous. Children all over the world had memorized the theme song. Adult viewers
viewers, surprising everybody, had also fallen in love with the show. SpongeBob had become a strange phenomenon, a children's cartoon that grown-ups watched on purpose, a tropical-themed comedy that was somehow making more money than almost any other show on television. Steven Hillenberg, looking at all of this, decided it was time to stop. His reasoning was simple. He had thought about it for a long time. He had a particular philosophy about animated shows. He believed that cartoons, like many creative projects, had a natural lifespan. There was a window during which the show was at its best. The early years, the energetic years, the years before the writers ran out of ideas and started repeating themselves. After that window closed, the quality usually fell. The jokes got tired. The characters became cardboard cutouts of who they had originally been. The audience could feel the difference, even if they could not always explain it. The show stopped being good. Hillenberg did not want this to happen to SpongeBob. He had already begun thinking, around the end of season 3, about ending the show on a high note. He pointed to other animated programs as examples. The Ren and Stimpy Show, one of the cartoons that had inspired him during his early career, had run for about as long as SpongeBob had at that point. 60 episodes was, by his own measurement, a typical run for an animated series. Most cartoons ran out of fresh ideas somewhere around that mark. Stretching a show beyond it was, in his view, a creative risk. He had a plan. He would make a SpongeBob movie. The movie would be the grand finale, the big, theatrical, feature-length conclusion of the whole series. SpongeBob and Patrick would go on the biggest adventure of their lives. The story would have stakes the show had never reached before. The movie would end with a clear, satisfying conclusion. And then the show would be done. Hillenberg announced the plan to himself and to his team in 2002. He paused production on the show after season 3 was complete. The team would not be making new television episodes for a while. They would all focus, as a group, on the movie instead. He brought in his closest collaborators. Paul Tibbitt, Derek Dryman, Aaron Springer, Kent Osborne, and Tim Hill helped him write the story. They worked on it for 3 months in a rented room inside a former bank in Glendale, California. Kent Osborne later joked that the room got, in his words, kind of gamey after a while. But the script came together. The movie was released on November 19th, 2004. It was called The SpongeBob SquarePants Movie. It was directed by Hillenberg himself. The film grossed more than $140 million worldwide. It received positive reviews. Critics liked it. Audiences loved it. It was, by every measurable standard, a success. This was meant to be the end. Hillenberg, with the movie in theaters and the celebrations winding down, planned to walk away. He would announce the end of the series. He would thank everybody. He would move on to other projects. He had ideas for new short films he wanted to make. He had been thinking for years about going back to smaller, more personal animation work, the kind of stuff he had been doing at CalArts before SpongeBob took over his life. Nickelodeon had different plans. The network looked at the numbers. SpongeBob was, by far, the most valuable property the channel owned. The show was generating staggering amounts of money for the company. Toys, clothing, lunchboxes, video games, theme park tie-ins. The show was, in the words of one of the show's storyboard directors named Sam Henderson, such a cash cow for the station that the network simply could not afford to let it end. Ending SpongeBob was a financial decision the executives could not make. The network told Hillenberg they wanted more episodes. Many more. They wanted the show to continue indefinitely. Hillenberg refused to keep running it. He had said his piece. He had made his movie. He believed the right thing to do was to step away. He would not be the showrunner anymore. He compromised in a different way. If the network wanted to continue making the show without him, he would not stop them. He would even stay involved, in a smaller capacity. He would keep his executive producer credit. He would review every episode after it was made. He would offer notes and suggestions when asked. But he would not be the day-to-day boss. He would not write the scripts. He would not direct the recording sessions. He would not be the man at the center of the operation anymore. He needed someone he trusted to take over. He picked Paul Tibbitt. Tibbitt had been with the show since the very beginning. He was a writer, a storyboard artist, and a director. He had been part of the original team Hillenberg had assembled for Rocko's Modern Life. He understood the tone of SpongeBob. He understood the characters. Hillenberg trusted his sense of humor. In Hillenberg's own words, Tibbitt captured the SpongeBob character's sense of humor in a way Hillenberg liked. The handoff happened sometime during the production of the movie. By 2005, when season 4 began airing, Tibbitt was officially in charge. Hillenberg was no longer the showrunner. He had stepped away from the daily work of making SpongeBob. The change was felt almost immediately by viewers writers and by other people who worked on the show. Many fans began noticing that something had shifted. The exact nature of the shift was hard to describe. SpongeBob, the character, started behaving differently. He became more childlike in some episodes, less the gentle adult he had been in the early years. The pacing of stories changed. The tone moved around in unpredictable ways. Some episodes were as good as anything from the first 3 seasons. Others felt off in some quiet way that fans struggled to articulate. Hillenberg himself, in later interviews, addressed this. He said something specific about the seasons that came after his departure. He said, in his view, that everything made after the 2004 movie should be thought of as prequels to the movie and to the original 3 seasons. The story, in his head, had ended with the movie. Anything that came after, in canon terms, took place earlier. This was his way of preserving the original ending he had wanted. Tibbett ran the show through season 9. He oversaw nearly 200 new episodes during that time. In 2015, he handed the role of showrunner over to Vincent Waller and Mark Ceccarelli, who had both been writers and storyboard artists on the show for years. Hillenberg returned briefly to the franchise for the second movie. The SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, was released in 2015. He co-wrote the story and acted as an executive producer. Tibbett directed it. The movie was again a financial success. Hillenberg had been pulled back into his own creation, gently, for a single project. Then, in 2017, on March 13th of that year, Hillenberg made a public announcement that broke the hearts of everyone who had ever loved his work. He had been diagnosed with a disease called ALS. The full name of the disease is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It is a condition that slowly attacks the nerves that control the muscles. It is sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease, after the famous baseball player who died from it in the 1940s. The disease has no cure. It progresses, slowly or quickly depending on the case, until the patient loses the ability to speak, to move, and eventually to breathe on their own. It is a brutal condition. There is no good outcome. Hillenberg announced the diagnosis publicly. He said he would continue working on SpongeBob for as long as he was able. He would still review episodes. He would still offer ideas. He would not let the disease end his involvement with the show he had spent decades building. The disease moved faster than his plans. By August of 2018, according to several people who worked with him, Hillenberg stopped coming into the Nickelodeon animation studio. Paul Tibbett confirmed this. So did the director, Mark Osborne. So did Tom Kenny. So did Vincent Waller. Hillenberg's body had reached the point where he could no longer make the trip. He was at home. He was being cared for. The days of him walking through the studio doors and talking with his crew were over. He passed away 3 months later. The date was November 26th, 2018. He was 57 years old. ALS had taken him. Nickelodeon released a statement. The network said they were incredibly saddened by the news. They said Hillenberg had been a beloved friend and a longtime creative partner to everyone at the network. They asked their fans to take a moment of silence in his memory. The show kept going. This was the strange thing. The man who had created SpongeBob was gone, and yet SpongeBob continued. Nickelodeon kept producing new episodes. The network developed a spin-off called Camp Coral, which features younger versions of the characters at summer camp. Hillenberg had told Tibbett years earlier, according to Tibbett, that he never wanted spin-offs. He once joked that the day Nickelodeon tried to make SpongeBob babies would be the day he walked out the door. Camp Coral aired anyway, in 2021, 3 years after Hillenberg's death. A third theatrical movie called The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge on the Run, was released in 2020. Hillenberg received a posthumous executive producer credit. He had not been involved in making it. His name appeared in the credits as a tribute, the same way it has appeared on every episode of the show made after his death. The series itself, as of recent counts, has aired more than 276 episodes. It is currently in its 13th season. It is the 4th longest-running American animated series in television history. It has outlived its creator by years and is still going. Hillenberg's wishes about how the show should end never came true. The story he wanted to tell finished, in his mind, with the 2004 movie. Everything after that was, in his framing, a kind of long prequel. The show he had wanted to walk away from in 2004 has now run for more than 2 decades after he tried to end it. New writers have come and gone, new directors, new voice actors for some characters. The world he built keeps unfolding without him. The yellow sponge is still inside his pineapple. The grumpy octopus is still in his stone head. The pirate man is still hosting from his living room in Encino. The Krabby Patty formula is still inside its glass bottle. Bikini Bottom still sits, quietly, beneath a real piece of ocean, named named after a place where humans once tested 23 nuclear bombs. The man who started all of it, who taught marine biology to small children in the 1980s and drew his comic book in 1989 and walked into the Nickelodeon office in a Hawaiian shirt in 1997, has been gone for several years now. The show he wanted to keep small, the small, simple cartoon he never quite wanted to outlive, has become one of the longest-running pieces of animation in human history. It airs every single day. Somewhere on Earth, right now, a child is watching SpongeBob for the first time. A teacher who could not get his comic book published. A pencil product trademark that nearly cost a character his name. An octopus drawn with the wrong number of legs. A pirate man with a cardboard hook. A nuclear test site quietly buried beneath a yellow sponge's pineapple. All of it, every piece of it, is still down there. Still working. Still humming away. Still living its small, cheerful, underwater life. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.